Chapter 1. The Descent. The air inside the landing pod was thick with anticipation. Enoch Greaves stood in the narrow compartment, eyes focused on the data streaming across his visor. Outside, Coronar 4 loomed, a planet known for its lethality. It was a swirling sphere of amber clouds and red sand, illuminated under a harsh, unyielding sun. Yet, Enoch wasn't here to sightsee. He was here to survive. 30 days on one of the deadliest worlds in the galaxy, with only the barest of supplies, just to prove that a human could do it. As the dropship entered Coronar IV's atmosphere, the temperature inside began to rise, an early taste of the planet's fury. Outside, radiation storms crackled in the upper layers of the atmosphere, sending waves of electromagnetic interference through the dropship systems. Enoch held onto the safety bar, feeling the ship rattle as it descended through turbulent clouds and hostile winds. On a research vessel in the planet's orbit, a dozen alien scientists and military officers monitored his descent with intense curiosity. This mission was broadcast live to numerous other ships, all watching the Deathworlder's trial. Most were convinced he wouldn't last a week, some even a day. Coronar 4 wasn't called a death world lightly. It was a place where every element seemed designed to eradicate life. Aboard the research vessel, the lead researcher, Dr. Tur, watched the display with skeptical eyes. The human insisted on no additional atmospheric filters, he asked his colleague, who nodded affirmatively. The alien scientist, tall and thin with skin that shimmered like molten metal, let out a skeptical sound. Foolish. Their physiology may be resilient, but this is madness. The dropship's descent thrusters fired, slowing its approach as it neared the ground. Enoch felt the impact as the pod finally landed, a violent jolt that pushed him against his harness. He exhaled deeply, staring through the narrow viewport. The landscape outside was barren, cracked earth stretching as far as he could see, interrupted only by the occasional jagged rock formation. He gathered his thoughts. No fancy technology, no advanced tools, only basic survival equipment. His mission was simple: survive by any means necessary. His visor flashed a warning about atmospheric toxicity, confirming what he'd read in the briefing. Without hesitation, Enoch put on his breathing mask, adjusted his gear, and opened the hatch. The air outside was searing hot, and the smell was a mix of sulfur and burning minerals. His mask filtered out the worst of it, but even through the suit, he could feel the heat trying to penetrate, as if Coronar 4 was trying to cook him alive. Enoch grinned behind the mask. The planet would have to try harder than that. As he took his first steps onto the cracked ground, the aliens watching from orbit leaned forward, eyes fixed on their monitors. He has no protective drones, no exosuit enhancers, one of them remarked, barely able to mask his disdain. Another observer scoffed. They call themselves Deathworlders, but Coronar 4 has broken much hardier species. This will end as we predicted. Enoch scanned his surroundings, noting the steep cliffs in the distance. They were likely home to shadowed recesses that might hold water, or at least offer some protection from the relentless heat. The first order of business was to find shelter, something solid enough to protect him when the sun dipped and the planet's temperature plummeted. He'd read about the drastic swings here. During the day, it was hot enough to burn through skin. At night, cold enough to freeze flesh in minutes. He had to find or build a place that could withstand both extremes. He started moving, his gaze constantly shifting, scanning for resources, anything that could help. His gear was limited to the essentials: a multipurpose tool, a few emergency rations, a water purifier, and some rudimentary survival materials. His mind, however, was his real asset. The aliens may have given him primitive tools, but he carried a lifetime of knowledge about survival, adaptability, and the unbreakable resolve that humanity was known for. Up in orbit, Dr. Tur watched Enoch's progress with a deepening frown. The human moved with purpose, eyes darting from one point to another, assessing, planning, but still, it seemed a fool's errand. The alien scientist pulled up his analysis of Coronar IV's terrain and climate, muttering to himself. He's heading toward the cliffs. Perhaps he believes they offer some kind of shelter. Arrogant. The cliffs house parasitic fauna. They'll drain his fluids before he realizes his mistake. Enoch reached the base of a cliff as the sun climbed higher, casting an intense orange glow over everything. He touched the rock, feeling its warmth through his gloves. With careful calculation, he started chipping at the stone, forming loose rock slabs that he could use for a temporary shelter. The ground here was hard-packed, offering enough stability for a small wall. Enoch began stacking rocks, building up a barrier that would block the wind and offer some shade. He worked methodically, moving swiftly as the heat intensified. The alien's scorn turned to curiosity. Enoch wasn't struggling. In fact, he seemed prepared. The broadcast zoomed in on his hands as he shaped the rocks, placing them in ways that maximized their stability. He wasn't building just a wall. He was constructing a windbreak, a shield to deflect the elements. Every move was deliberate. After hours of labor, Enoch had managed to create a small alcove shielded on 3 sides, with enough room to crouch. The aliens observed in baffled silence. They expected him to falter, to abandon his efforts in despair, but he only grew more resolute. He sat back, inspecting his work with satisfaction. His first shelter, a crude one, but it would hold. Dr. Turres' frown deepened. The human is not just strong. He's calculating. I expected brute endurance, but this is strategic survival. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and Enoch retreated into his makeshift shelter. He wrapped himself in thermal layers, using stones he'd warmed earlier in the day to help retain heat. Outside, the wind howled, biting and cold. Enoch pulled his scarf tighter, pressing his back against the stone wall as he huddled in the cramped space. On the research vessel, the aliens continued to watch, still skeptical. Yet, they couldn't deny the intrigue growing among them. This Deathworlder had not only survived his first day on Cornar 4, but had adapted quickly, using the planet's resources to his advantage. They'd expected a desperate fight for life, but what they saw was something else entirely. A human demonstrating ingenuity, resilience, and a calmness in the face of danger that defied everything they thought they knew about his species. Dr. Tur finally broke the silence. Begin a full log. This human might surprise us after all. As Enoch drifted into a light sleep, his mind still alert to the sounds outside, the aliens above marveled at the first day's events. What had started as a cynical experiment had now captured their full attention, and as Enoch slept beneath the alien sky, they realized they might be witnessing a new understanding of the Deathworlder species. Chapter 2. Shelter and Shock. The morning came with a punishing rise in temperature, accompanied by winds that carried fine grains of abrasive sand. Enoch emerged from his makeshift shelter, his every move watched intently by the crew aboard the orbiting research vessel. While he'd survived the first night, his challenges were only beginning. Cornar IV's temperature could rise fast enough to kill most unprotected species within an hour, and with resources as scarce as they were, the odds still weren't in his favor. Enoch stretched and glanced around, his gaze sharp and focused. He took stock of his supplies and inspected the area, searching for clues on how to fortify his shelter. His rudimentary structure had held up through the night, but he knew it was far from ideal. The rocks he'd used were stacked but not fixed, meaning they'd easily crumble if the winds grew stronger or if he needed to shield himself from any of the planet's infamous sandstorms. From the research vessel, Dr. Tur observed with skepticism. He may have made it through the night, but this won't last. Cornar IV's environment is unforgiving. It won't take much more for him to reach his breaking point. One of his colleagues, a data analyst with violet skin and multiple eyes, adjusted her monitor to zoom in on Enoch's shelter. Perhaps we're underestimating him. His species is known for its adaptability. Dr. Tur dismissed her comment with a wave. Adaptability is one thing, but survival here requires more than that. He's bound to fail soon enough. Unbothered by their doubts, Enoch set out toward the cliffs. He knew he needed more than just a pile of rocks to survive the coming days. The cliffs, however, were a gamble. He'd read in his mission briefing that they were home to certain life forms, adapted to Cornar IV's harsh conditions, some of which were potentially dangerous. But he needed resources, anything he could use to reinforce his shelter, and perhaps even find water, if he got lucky. As he climbed the jagged path leading up the cliffside, his boots grinding against the rough stone, the aliens aboard the research vessel watched with morbid fascination. Enoch moved with caution, his eyes darting to every crevice and shadow. He was aware that the cliffs were rumored to harbor parasitic creatures, life forms that drained fluids from unsuspecting prey. But as a human trained in survival, he relied on more than just caution. He assessed his surroundings with the trained eye of someone who knew how to read the land, to listen for the slightest movements, and to anticipate threats before they emerged. When he reached a natural ledge halfway up the cliff, Enoch began gathering long, fibrous vines clinging to the rock face. To the untrained eye, they might appear useless, but he recognized them as potentially valuable, durable enough to use as rope or binding for reinforcing his shelter. He looped them into his pack, making sure to leave the roots intact to avoid triggering the vine's defensive mechanisms. The alien observers murmured among themselves, astounded at his precision and knowledge. Dr. Turre's skepticism wavered slightly as he watched Enoch secure the vines with practiced hands, not unlike the way certain creatures on their own worlds harvested resources without disturbing the ecosystem. This wasn't the frantic scrabbling they'd anticipated. It was calculated, intelligent work. By the time Enoch returned to his shelter, the day's temperature had risen sharply, and the air shimmered with the heat. He wasted no time reinforcing his shelter, weaving the vines through the stacked rocks, using them to bind the structure tightly. With patience and efficiency, he secured each stone, creating a barrier that would hold against the punishing winds and provide a more stable refuge at night. The aliens aboard the research vessel observed his progress with an unexpected mix of admiration and shock. "He's not building a permanent structure," one alien commented, disbelief evident in his tone. "How does he know exactly what to do with these limited resources?" Enoch didn't just stop with the shelter, though. Using his multipurpose tool, he began to dig a shallow trench outside the structure, an improvised trap to collect any condensation that might form when the temperature dropped again. It was a gamble. Corner 4 had almost no natural sources of water, but he wasn't one to rely on assumptions. Every small chance was worth taking. As he worked, sweat began to soak his shirt beneath his protective layers. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he knew he needed to ration his water intake carefully. If his condensation trap yielded even a few drops, it would be worth the effort. To the alien observers, his efforts bordered on insanity. Here he was, facing a planet that could kill him in multiple ways, yet he was calmly working, adapting, making this deadly world his own. Dr. Tur leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. He's not just surviving, he's preparing. It's as if he believes he can tame this place. Throughout the day, Enoch continued to improve his shelter and explore the surrounding area. He found a few hardy plants, which he marked with stones for later examination. If they were edible, they'd be an invaluable food source. Otherwise, he could potentially use them as fuel. His every action was a step forward in his strategy to not only survive, but to create a base that would sustain him for as long as necessary. When night fell, he retreated into his fortified shelter, securing the opening with a makeshift door of rocks and vines. The aliens observed with a mix of fascination and awe. None had expected him to survive this long, let alone begin to create a livable space. And yet, here he was, adapting to every new challenge with the quiet determination of a Deathworlder. Inside his shelter, Enoch carefully checked his supplies. He had less than half of his water left, and his food rations were dwindling. But the condensation trap had yielded a small amount of water, not enough to drink but sufficient for him to feel his efforts weren't wasted. He noted this with satisfaction. Even small victories could mean the difference between life and death. Outside, the planet's temperature plummeted again, and winds picked up, carrying tiny particles of sand that scraped against his shelter's walls. Enoch listened to the sound, a constant reminder of where he was. He was alone on a hostile world, surrounded by elements that could kill him if he let his guard down. But instead of fear, he felt an odd sense of calm. Every challenge Corner 4 threw at him was a test, and he had every intention of passing. In the research vessel above, the alien crew watched the human settle down for the night, his shelter holding firm against the elements. Dr. Turre's disbelief was slowly turning into respect. "He's demonstrating something we hadn't accounted for," he admitted to his team. "A kind of ingenuity that goes beyond resilience." His assistant looked at him, intrigued. "Do you think he could actually survive for the full 30 days? Dr. Tur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the human on the monitor, a thoughtful expression on his face. "If he does, we may need to revise our understanding of his species entirely." Inside the shelter, Enoch leaned back against the rock wall, his breathing slow and steady. The harsh environment outside was quiet for now, and his makeshift walls provided a temporary sanctuary. His eyes closed, but his mind remained alert, already planning his next steps, thinking of ways to improve his situation further. He'd survived 2 days on Cornair 4, and each day he felt himself learning, adapting. The aliens who had doubted him were beginning to watch with something approaching admiration, though he didn't know it. All he knew was that he was here to survive, to show that humans were capable of thriving even in the most dangerous environments. And as he drifted into a light sleep, the shelter he'd built held firm, defying the harsh elements of the planet. But he knew the hardest days were still ahead, and he was ready for whatever Cornair 4 had to throw at him. Chapter 3: Battle for Survival. The third week on Cornair 4 tested Enoch in ways he hadn't anticipated. His body was bruised, scratched, and worn thin from lack of sustenance. Each day, he faced relentless challenges: searing heat by day, freezing cold by night, and a constant threat of dehydration. But he was still alive, still pushing forward, his determination as unyielding as the unforgiving landscape around him. The aliens watching from the research vessel had grown silent in their criticism. No one expected the human to make it this far. Instead of suffering a slow demise, Enoch had built a functional shelter, devised ways to gather water, and even started rationing his supplies with military precision. He had transformed from an object of ridicule into a subject of fascination and study. Dr. Tur and his team had begun cataloging Enoch's methods, recording each step he took in this deadly game of survival. They were learning about human resilience in real time, and with each new development, their astonishment grew. On the planet's surface, Enoch's body moved almost by instinct. His mind was sharp, despite the exhaustion that clawed at him. His thoughts were a constant assessment of risk versus reward, each decision carrying the weight of survival. This was a mindset drilled into him from years of training, and here, it became second nature. In the harsh sunlight of another blistering day, Enoch climbed a rocky hill near his shelter. He needed to scout for new sources of food and water, as his resources were quickly dwindling. The planet offered no kindness, no signs of life beyond the hardy plants he'd seen clinging to the cliffs. But he knew from experience that even the deadliest places had secrets to offer, if one knew where to look. Reaching the top of the hill, Enoch scanned the horizon, his visor shielding his eyes from the sun's intense glare. In the distance, he saw a cluster of strange, metallic plants with tendrils reaching into the sky. They were twisted and sharp, like alien barbed wire, and seemed to grow in dense patches. Intrigued, he descended toward them, his curiosity piqued. Any sign of life was worth investigating. If he could find a use for the plants, it might extend his chances of survival. The alien scientists, observing his movements, were just as intrigued. They had cataloged the plant species he was approaching as highly toxic, known to secrete a corrosive sap that could eat through most materials, including flesh. The researchers exchanged glances, wondering if the human knew what he was dealing with. Dr. Tur leaned closer to his monitor, watching Enoch with a mixture of concern and fascination. "He doesn't realize what he's dealing with," he muttered. "One wrong move, and that plant will reduce his hands to bone." As Enoch approached the metallic plants, he took out a small piece of cloth from his gear, wrapping it around his hands. He inspected the plant closely, noting the greenish sap that oozed from its barbed edges. The sap had an acrid smell, and he knew enough about toxic substances to proceed with caution. Using a sharp stone, he carefully pried a small piece of the plant loose, wrapping it in cloth and stowing it away in his pack. From the research vessel, the aliens watched in shock. Enoch had managed to extract a sample without injury, something they hadn't expected. It wasn't just his physical endurance that impressed them, it was his intelligence, his ability to analyze and adapt even in the face of unknown dangers. For a species so often underestimated, Enoch was showing them the potential humans had to survive in the most hostile conditions. Back at his shelter, Enoch examined the sample under a makeshift magnifying lens, analyzing the plant structure. He tested the sap on a small piece of rock, observing as it corroded the surface within seconds. The corrosive properties were impressive, but Enoch saw potential. If he could harness the sap in a controlled way, it might serve as a weapon or a tool for defense against the wildlife he'd encountered. Over the past few days, he had noticed strange tracks near his shelter, signs of a large creature that roamed the area at night. Though he hadn't seen it yet, he knew it was watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. The tracks were unlike anything he'd seen before, three-toed prints with claw marks that suggested an apex predator. Whatever it was big, and it had marked his territory. The aliens observed as Enoch set up traps around his shelter, using vines, sharpened sticks, and small amounts of the corrosive sap he'd harvested. The ingenuity of his methods was astonishing. In their eyes, he was no longer just surviving. He was preparing, turning his temporary refuge into a fortified camp. Dr. Tur spoke into the quiet room. This isn't just survival. This human is taking control of his environment, adapting to every new challenge. We have misjudged his species. That night, as the temperature plummeted, Enoch waited in his shelter, listening to the sounds outside. The planet was deceptively quiet at night, the stillness broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the distant call of nocturnal creatures. His traps were set, and he waited, alert for any sign of movement. Then he heard a faint rustling, followed by the soft thud of something heavy moving outside. His muscles tensed, every nerve on high alert. Whatever was out there was getting closer, drawn by the scent of his shelter or the remnants of food he'd eaten earlier. Enoch held his breath, his hand resting on a sharpened stick he'd fashioned into a crude spear. The alien scientists, watching through their night vision feeds, saw the creature approach. It was a hulking predator, with scales that gleamed under the faint light of Coronar IV's moons. Its eyes were dark and piercing, scanning the area with intelligence. The creature was nearly twice Enoch's size, a hunter perfectly adapted to this world. It moved with a slow, calculated precision, creeping toward his shelter. Inside, Enoch's heartbeat was steady, his mind focused. He knew the traps he'd set were rudimentary, but they might buy him the few seconds he needed if the creature got too close. He watched the shadows through a crack in the shelter's wall, waiting as the beast drew nearer, sniffing the air. Then, there was a snap-triggered trap. The creature howled in pain as one of Enoch's sharpened sticks punctured its leg, coated in corrosive sap. The beast recoiled, thrashing as the sap began to eat away at its scales. Seizing the opportunity, Enoch burst from his shelter, spear in hand. He moved with practiced precision, striking the creature's injured leg and forcing it back. The aliens on the research vessel were speechless. They watched as Enoch fought with a bravery and ruthlessness they hadn't expected. He didn't just fend off the creature, he drove it away, forcing it to retreat into the night, injured and wary. It was a victory, however small, but in that moment, it was clear that Enoch was more than just a survivor. He was a warrior, a predator in his own right. As he returned to his shelter, bloodied but unharmed, Enoch felt a surge of relief. He had defended his territory, proven his strength in the face of danger. And as he sat in the quiet of his shelter, exhaustion creeping over him, he knew that every day on this planet was shaping him, testing the limits of his resilience. The aliens watched in stunned silence. Dr. Tur finally spoke, his voice filled with a respect that hadn't been there before. We have witnessed something extraordinary. This human, he is not just surviving. He is conquering this world, one challenge at a time. His colleagues nodded, unable to argue. Enoch's journey on Coronar 4 was no longer just a test of endurance. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the indomitable spirit of a species they had underestimated. And as Enoch settled in for the night, ready to face whatever came next, the aliens knew they were witnessing history, a testament to the power of the human will and the limitless potential of a Deathworlder. Chapter 4. The Day of Reckoning. The 30th day dawned cold and quiet, with Coronar IV's red-tinged sun casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. Enoch sat at the entrance of his shelter, staring out at the world he had called home for the past month. His face was leaner, weathered by the harsh conditions, and his eyes had a calm intensity that came only from facing death day after day. This planet had tested him, pushed him to the edge of survival, but he had endured. Over the past days, he had fine-tuned his shelter into a miniature fortress. What had begun as a simple pile of rocks was now a fully reinforced structure, capable of withstanding the deadly winds and sudden sandstorms that plagued the landscape. His condensation trap provided enough water to sustain him, and he had discovered a way to render some of the planet's strange plants into an edible if not exactly tasty paste. He had even managed to ward off more predators, using his traps and the corrosive sap as makeshift defenses. The research vessel orbiting Coronar 4 had become a hive of activity. The aliens were no longer just observing. They were documenting, studying every aspect of Enoch's survival methods. Data analysts, biologists, and military strategists alike were captivated by the humans' ingenuity and strength. Dr. Tur, who had initially dismissed the experiment as futile, had grown to admire Enoch's tenacity. He now regarded the human with a respect reserved only for the most formidable beings in the galaxy. As the final hours approached, the crew prepared for Enoch's extraction. The retrieval team was ready, waiting for the signal from the surface. But something unusual had happened within the ranks of the alien observers, a sense of reverence, almost like a vigil, as they prepared to welcome back a man who had defied all odds. On the planet's surface, Enoch was not unaware of his accomplishment. The anticipation of rescue filled him with a quiet pride, but he was also reluctant to leave behind the shelter he had built. In a way, he had grown attached to the place, to the rhythms of survival that had defined his days and nights here. This harsh, deadly world had become a part of him, and he a part of it. Just before the extraction signal, Enoch packed his few belongings, taking one last look around his shelter. He had left behind carvings on the rocks, a record of his days, etched in crude lines and symbols that told the story of his survival. It was a silent message to anyone or anything that might come across it in the future. Here lived a human who had not only survived but thrived. When the dropship arrived, its engines scattering dust across the rocky ground, Enoch shielded his face and approached. The alien retrieval team, cloaked in environmental suits, stared at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He climbed aboard without a word, and as the ship lifted off, he gazed out at the shelter, watching it fade into the distance. Inside the dropship, the aliens were quiet, their eyes unable to meet his. They had watched him through every moment, every challenge, yet being in his presence now, face to face, was something entirely different. Enoch could see the respect in their gazes, the admiration they held for him as they sat in silent acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. When he arrived on the research vessel, a crowd had gathered to greet him. Dr. Tur stood at the forefront, his usually impassive face softened by an expression of genuine respect. As Enoch stepped onto the deck, the aliens broke into an applause, an unprecedented display of admiration for a human, a Deathworlder, who had defied the impossible. Dr. Tur approached him, extending a hand, a gesture that carried immense weight among his species. Enoch accepted, shaking his hand firmly. "We are humbled by what we have witnessed," Dr. Tur said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have shown us a side of your species that we did not understand. We thought we knew what humans were capable of, but you have redefined our understanding." Enoch smiled, his face lined with exhaustion yet brightened by a quiet pride. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but that's what we do. Humans are made to adapt, to push through whatever stands in our way." The crew members around him nodded, their faces filled with awe. They had expected failure, but what they had seen was resilience, a quality that surpassed anything they had known. Enoch's survival was more than just an individual feat, it was a testament to the human spirit, a revelation that had shaken the scientific community to its core. As the research team continued to ask him questions, eager to learn more about his methods and experiences, Enoch's thoughts drifted back to Coronar 4. He had left a part of himself on that desolate world, a piece of his spirit etched into the rocks, a silent mark of his endurance. He knew that he would carry the memory of those days with him forever, a reminder of what he had faced and overcome. Dr. Tur and his team would go on to publish their findings, a comprehensive study of human adaptability and resilience, a document that would circulate through the galaxy, reshaping the way humans were viewed by other species. No longer seen as mere curiosities, humans would be recognized as beings capable of immense strength, tenacity, and the unyielding will to survive even on the deadliest of worlds. As Enoch looked out the window of the research vessel, watching the planet grow smaller in the distance, he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had proven something fundamental, not just to the aliens but to himself. Humans, he realized, were made to endure, to face the harshest challenges head-on, and to leave their mark on even the most unforgiving places. And somewhere down on Coronar 4, his shelter stood as a silent monument to that truth, a testament to the resilience of a Deathworlder who had not only survived but thrived.